Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of Hurd in the House, the podcast for Colorado's 3rd Congressional District. Today's guest is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Government and Public Affairs for the National Shooting Sports Foundation, Larry Keane. For our listeners back in Colorado and across the nation, Second Amendment and firearm legislation often comes up as a hotbed issue. I actually had a town hall just last night that it came up on. Especially for rural Americans for whom firearms are a very regular part of their everyday lives, like so many in Colorado's 3rd District. However, even for Americans that don't live in rural communities, protecting access to firearms matters for safety. It is a vital part of our nation's economy. And of course, it is a freedom granted to us by the Second Amendment. Larry Keane has been with the NSSF for the past 26 years, working as general counsel in public relations, and is an advocate for the protection of the manufacturers, distributors, and Americans in the firearm industry. His work also includes testifying before congressional committees. I've seen some of that, and leading efforts to expand firearm safety education and law enforcement programs. If there was ever someone who knows the true landscape of the firearm industry and the legislation that affects it, it is Larry. Larry Keane, welcome to Hurd in the House.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and I appreciate your allowing me an opportunity to visit with you.
So, Larry, let's start at the top.
Your introduction is too kind.
Well, you've got a lot of experience, and I think that's something that our listeners will really appreciate and value. Larry, let's start at the top. For listeners who may not be familiar, what is the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and what role does it play in representing the firearm industry here in the United States?
The National Shooting Sports Foundation, or NSSF for short, is the Firearms Industries Trade Association. So our members are all of the major firearms and ammunition manufacturers, companies, and not large companies that you've never heard of. The manufacturers of firearms, ammunition, optics, really companies that make products for hunting market, the shooting sports market, personal defense. We have distributor members as well as thousands and thousands of FFLs, gun stores, retailers,
right,
all across the United States. Everything from the big box, or what we call corporate retailers, down to individual single store, mom and pop gun stores on the backcountry road.
And is this across the country?
We're about 10,000 members.
10,000
all
members.
Across the country, including Colorado.
All right. Very good. No, I know you have a number of NSSF members in the state of Colorado as well. I want to ask you a question that a lot of folks don't necessarily think about. Is there's often a perception that the work you do is just about politics, but there's also a major economic component. Can you walk our listeners through the scale of the firearm industry at all levels and its impact on jobs and on local economies across our country?
So the industry is responsible for several 100,000 jobs across the United States, both direct jobs and what economists call induced jobs, all across the country. And our economic impact on the U.S. economy is pretty sizable, several $1 billion a year in economic impact on the economy. And again, our industry employs people in every state, all across the country. When you consider manufacturers, distributors, retailers, companies that support those manufacturers, et cetera, that make component parts, and OEM suppliers. So it's pretty considerable. And the industry has been fortunately growing over time, certainly much larger now than when I started at NSSF 26 years ago. And our members pay the Pittman-Robertson excise tax, which is a primary source of conservation funding in the United States, and we're very, very proud of that. It's what makes wildlife conservation really possible in the United States. Those Pittman-Robertson dollars are distributed back to the states through U.S. Fish and Wildlife per a statutory formula, and that's the primary source of conservation funding.
That's right. And I was on a bill that was signed by the president. I sponsored a bill relating to Pittman-Robertson in this last congressional session, and I'm proud to have supported that and the great work it does for education, but wetlands conservation, access for hunters and sportsmen. It was a great bill. I was proud to support, and I'm very glad the president signed it.
Well, let me just say, Congressman, this is your first term, but you have already established yourself as one of the leading voices in Congress on conservation, natural resources. Your work, you've been a real leader on this, and we really, truly appreciate everything that you're doing in Congress to support conservation, hunters, access, public lands. I mean, the list goes on.
That means a lot to me. Well, it's because I've got great folks like you in industry that help us here in Congress shape good public policy. That certainly doesn't just happen on its own. It happens with thoughtful input from the folks like you who understand the needs of folks across the country and what good public policy looks like. So speaking of that, NSSF sits at the intersection of industry and policy. How involved is the organization in helping shape legislation and in engaging with policymakers at the state and federal levels?
Sure. And NSSF is the Firearms Industry Trade Association, is a very robust government relations program that I'm fortunate enough to have the opportunity to lead. So we have a Washington, D.C. office. We're very involved, as you know, we're working with folks like yourself on federal policy. But we also have a complete state government affairs team spread out across the country, and we are present in every single state capital in the nation, including Colorado. And we've been spending a fair bit of time in Colorado working on
unfortunately
policy issues. Yeah, more than we'd like to.
And one of the things, Larry, I will tell you, I hear about that consistently, frustration from the constituents that I represent about what's happening in our state. I think Senate Bill 25003 on the state side from the last legislative session was a big problem for sportsmen and hunters and Second Amendment advocates. And there's constantly a stream of legislation that's coming out. And I just had a town hall last night where I had another question about that and what we can do on the state level. And I'm going to get to that with you because I'm curious. I'm sure you have some thoughts. A lot of the people that are listening to this are going to be people that live in Colorado's 3rd Congressional District and who vote on the state level on these issues and help elect state officials that have a say on these Second Amendment issues. And I'm going to ask you in a little bit to what advice you have for those folks on how to think about what's happening in the state of Colorado and how to address that. But first, I wanted to ask you, one of the other things that NSSF does that I don't think a lot of people in the public generally know about as much, but it's just as important as safety. Safety is a core part of your mission as well. What are some of the key programs that NSSF leads to promote responsible firearm ownership?
Well, we have a very robust firearms safety education program on a number of components. It's very important to the industry and our members. We have a whole campaign we call Real Solutions for Safer Communities. And among the components of that effort includes, for example, Project Child Safe, which is the largest firearm safety education program in the United States that we've been doing since about 1999. We, the industry, have distributed over 41 or 42 million firearms safety education kits for free all across the United States, including Colorado, working with local law enforcement as our distribution partners. And Project Child Safe provides firearm safety education, stresses the importance of safe storage of firearms when not in use. The kit includes a free cable-style gun lock because cable locks can fit on almost all actions to make firearms, inoperable when not in use. And of course, there's no one solution. Everyone's situation is different, but the importance, we stress the importance of, securing the firearm when not in use from individuals who can't be trusted to use the firearm safely, which would obviously include children, people who, that are experiencing, suicide, ideation and things like that. Right. So we're very proud of that program. It's been recognized as like by the federal government is one of the most effective programs. But we also put out all manner of firearm safety education publications and videos that are available on our website. We work with the Veterans Administration to provide, support and locking devices for the VA to provide to vets who are struggling. We have, as you know, sadly, very high rate of suicide involving veterans. So we're working with the VA. We also work with the largest firearms suicide prevention organization in the country called American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and with our retailer and range members and the public to help ranges and retailers and family members talk to others about that are struggling, that might be depressed or potentially suicidal. It's called brave conversation, and so we work in the suicide prevention space as well. So hunter education, the whole panoply. So it's very, very important, and I'm very happy to say that since we started, for example, Project Child Safe, the number of accidental firearm deaths in the United States has declined rather considerably, and they're at the lowest levels they've ever been since record keeping began in the early part of the 1900s.
That's fantastic.
Now, it's not just as a result of Project Child Safe, but we certainly have proud to say we've contributed to that. And again, you pick up any firearm, you open up the box and read the manual, there will be a discussion in the manual about safe storage, proper handling, and how to avoid accidents. And so, and every manufacturer in the country now provides some form of a locking device or locking mechanism with each new firearm that's shipped from the factory. And of course, you can walk into any gun store in the United States and, they have storage devices available to you, everything from big, expensive safes down to simple, cable style gun locks. The importance of, securing your firearm when not in use in order to prevent tragedies, which, still occur, unfortunately, but, we'll continue to work on that effort. It's very, very important.
You're right. Now that I think about it, all of the firearms I purchased, they have come with a locking device. So that's standard. That this just didn't happen to be the weapons I purchased. That's all of the weapons that come. That's interesting. That's good to know.
The industry's been doing that since the mid '90s, and some manufacturers have been doing it for decades earlier. So it's very important to the industry. We don't want to see products. Issues. Look, firearms are dangerous. That's sort of the point, particularly if you're using them for self-defense. So they have to be respected and they have to be treated responsibly. And you can't leave, loaded firearms laying around accessible to children, obviously.
That's right.
I mean, it's common sense.
Well, and we tell our kids, I've talked to all of my kids about gun safety and also what to do if you see a weapon at a friend's house or something like that. Immediately tell an adult right away. All of the safety things that I think are important for responsible gun ownership. So that's terrific work that you all are doing at NSSF, and I noted and appreciated. Now, Larry, I'm going to drag you back a little bit in time here. Let's go back to the beginning of your career, or maybe at least before NSSF. I understand that you started your career as an assistant district attorney in Westchester County. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
What drew you into that role?
So I grew up in New York.
And your dad was a cop, wasn't he? A New York.
My dad was a New York City police officer. Several of my uncles were police officers. So I grew up in a police family, in New York. And so very early on, I had an interest in that. When I was graduating college, I thought about joining the police department. My father talked me out of that and said, go to law school or at least become an FBI agent. So I went to law school and really for the purpose of becoming a prosecutor. And I worked, when I was going to law school, I worked in the Manhattan DA's office for a while. And then when I graduated, I joined the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, where I spent about 7 or so years. And I had actually the opportunity to work with Janine Pirro when she was running the nation's first domestic violence unit. And then I had a big white collar crime case in front of her when she was judge. And then for a short time, I worked for her when she was the Westchester County DA. And then I left there and went to private practice, where I ended up representing gun companies, which is sort of how I eventually ended up at NSSF.
Now, my research just told me you also did some violent crime prosecutions and organized crime prosecutions when you were at the Westchester County DA's office as well.
Yeah, I started out doing, basically street crime, violent crime for a while, and then I moved into what was called the Economic Crime Bureau. And so I did complex white-collar cases, which very often involved organized crime. One of the biggest cases I had when I was there was an insurance fraud that involved a chiropractor and ripping off an insurance company with the Teamsters local. And it turned out that, he was paying money to organized crime family in Brooklyn because he had a gambling debt.
Wow.
And so we, ended up, working on some organized crime stuff. A lot of white collar crime behind it is organized crime, very often.
Yeah.
So it was very fun. It was enjoyable. Loved it. And I spent, about 7 years doing that. Really enjoyed it. If I won the lottery tomorrow, I would probably go back to doing that kind of stuff because I loved it. And it was just in my DNA, growing up, in a cop family.
Right. Well, I see an arc to your career here, Larry, and a thread that runs through it that makes sense. And now, as in your role as overseeing government relations and legal operations and public affairs and more for NSSF, a national organization with more than 10,000 members of all sizes, what does a typical week look like for you in that role?
I don't know that there's a typical week. I'll, a lot of travel, going to, spend a lot of time in Washington running our DC office. And a lot next week I'll be at a meeting of attorneys general. And then I will be at industry meetings. So it's pretty busy.
Now, did you build NSSF's government affairs relations infrastructure from the ground up, or was there something that you took over, or did you have to build it up?
No, I was hired in May of 2000 when the city lawsuits against the industry were being filed. I had been representing gun companies in private practice for a number of years, product liability cases, and in really what were the early days of the political lawsuits against the industry that sought to blame the industry for the actions of criminals, which gave rise to the city lawsuits back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I joined NSSF. I think we maybe had 15, 17 people at the time. As the first general counsel, there was no legal department, there was no general counsel, we had no government relations capability, we had no public affairs capabilities, but NSSF became the coordinating hub for the industry to have a unified defense against the city lawsuits that were an existential threat to the existence of the industry. And if the industry was bankrupted, which was the objective of these lawsuits, there would be no Second Amendment, right? The industry was bankrupted.
Right.
So I'm very proud. And over time, we've, added capability. We've grown our government relations program, to include federal lobbyists, to include state lobbyists. We've opened up a Washington, D.C. office to have a much bigger presence and influence on Capitol Hill. And then, we've also expanded our state affairs operations, as I mentioned, we have, people covering every single state capital in the country. And then we built out our regulatory capabilities, interfacing with ATF, Fish and Wildlife, BLM, Forest Service, the Bureau of Industry Security and Commerce that licenses exports, with the State Department that licenses exports of some products. We had none of those relationships or none of that capability when I started. And then we also built out our public affairs capability. So now, we regularly are quoted in news articles on, firearms and conservation policy issues. Then we built out our research capability to support what we do on the policy front, to bring to the legislators economic information that helps inform their decision making.
Right.
Both for, we spent a lot of time and effort to try to increase the number of public shooting ranges. So we've changed the law to allow it, Pittman Robertson dollars to be more easily spent by the states to build shooting ranges. We're working in past legislation to require the Forest Service and BLM to have public shooting range in each unit and district in consultation with local stakeholders, but to increase the number of public shooting ranges, because the more public shooting there is, the more conservation dollars are raised through the Pittman Robertson excise tax. That helps conservation, and it helps wildlife in the United States. So that's very important to us.
One of those great shooting ranges is. Oh, go ahead.
No, I have to say, very proud of what we've been able to build over time, and we've got built out our legal capability. We're involved in a lot of litigation to protect the Second Amendment, to challenge ill-advised and unconstitutional bans on commonly owned firearms like modern sporting rifles, like we've seen, unfortunately, in Colorado and other states. Things ebb and flow. So very early on, there was a lot of litigation that was a major focus for me. I helped to write the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which is under attack now. It's 20 years old, but it's under attack by anti-gun forces trying to erode the protections for the industry and ultimately protections for the Second Amendment to continue to exist and be exercised by law-abiding Americans.
Right. Larry, you mentioned the Pittman Robertson and dollars and shooting ranges. We have a number of good shooting ranges in the 3rd Congressional District. One of them is not too far from where I live, the Cameo Shooting Complex. And I was there earlier this year with my sons, and we were shooting, and I had a constituent that I was so focused on, being with my boys and making sure that we were being safe and doing things the right way, that I had a constituent there that he reached out and was like, "How come you didn't even say hi to me?" And I was like, "I'm so sorry, George. I was just distracted. I was, focused on my boys and wasn't thinking." So I would tell any of my constituents, if you see me at a shooting range and I don't immediately say hello and recognize it's because I'm dialed in and focused with my boys. But that's another great shooting complex. I think that's one of the best, maybe in the country. I'm maybe a little bit biased there, Larry, and I don't expect you to take sides there, but we have some great ones, in particular the Cameo Shooting Complex in Western Colorado. Now, you mentioned the public affairs piece of what you're doing. You are often the public voice of the industry, whether in media or in Congress, in lots of high pressure moments. How do you approach communicating on issues that can be sensitive and complex? What's your approach to messaging when it comes to these important issues and making sure that the voice of sportsmen and hunters and Second Amendment advocates is both heard and it's effectively, and the message is received?
Well, I think that I'm able to use the skills I developed in law school, like yourself, and I learned and developed as a prosecutor trying cases, how to talk to a jury. I mean, in simple, plain English and to try to communicate, in digestible, easy to understand phrasing. So I think I have that ability and have used it to my, to advance our position. But and it helps if you're passionate and you believe in the issue. But it's really, understanding both sides of the issue, understanding the other side's argument, and responding to them with better arguments, and treating the audience with respect. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud about from my career is that in the immediate aftermath of the Sandy Hook tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, where my family lived at the time, where NSSF was headquartered at the time, I received awards from organizations as the lobbyist of the year because of the way I handled the media appearances in the immediate aftermath of a highly charged, emotionally charged school shooting. So it was very, very high pressure, high intense, very emotional. But
Mm-hmm.
you had to don't get angry, don't argue, don't yell. You got to stay calm. You got to make your point. Recognizing that not everyone's going to agree with you, but if you believe in your position and you advocate for it. So I think the skills I developed as a lawyer and law school and earlier parts of my career really helped in that regard. I remember, as I'm sure you do, right? Like litigating cases and preparing for trial and all the hard work that went into that, and using those skills as a lobbyist. I mean, I used to joke with people that being a lobbyist was a hell of a lot easier than being a litigator. But put those skills to use in preparing for meetings and marshaling facts to support your argument.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a very enjoyable career, and I think we've made a difference, supporting our industry members, supporting the Second Amendment, and working for gun owners, hunters, sportsmen all across the country.
Mm-hmm.
But those challenges continue, and I think they always will. It's a very divisive issue, particularly on the sort of core gun control issues. One of the nice things about conservation is it typically can garner bipartisan support, and I commend you for your efforts at bipartisanship on these issues, in Colorado and in Congress. So it's important. I mean, and as I said, you've been a true leader on the conservation front. Even as a freshman member, you really put your mark on this issue, and we really appreciate everything you're doing for conservation.
Well, thanks, Larry. I'm trying to be a thoughtful, hardworking, and effective legislator, and where we can work together across the aisle, we do that. I'm actually proud on the Pittman-Robertson, the work that we did, the wildlife conservation, the Pittman-Robertson work that we did this last session. I think one of my prime co-sponsors on that was a Democrat colleague from Maryland. So that is an example of trying to be effective, work across the aisle where we can, and do good things. When it comes to, let's just zoom out really quickly, where things stand today, how would you describe the current landscape of legislation when it comes to Second Amendment issues that matter to gun owners, sportsmen, hunters, Second Amendment advocates? Where do things stand from your perspective at the federal level?
The gun issue, gun control is sort of the tip of the spear in the kind of cultural wars that are going on in this country. So it's very, very contentious. It's hard to build bipartisanship on sort of core gun control issues, Second Amendment issues. For example, concealed carry reciprocity, and we really appreciate your co-sponsorship of HR 38, the Constitutional Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act.
Absolutely. For listeners that may not be familiar, what does that bill do, and why is it significant?
It allows, if you have the Supreme Court has said that you have an individual constitutional right to keep and bear, meaning to carry on your person for self-protection, firearms. And, it's chiefly regulated at the state level, and you have, in most states, you need to have some sort of concealed carry permit from your government, the state government or your local government, and you can't necessarily carry that firearm with you across state lines because a whole different regulatory regime exists, and there's some reciprocity between states that will recognize that other states concealed carry. But what this bill will do is basically say that if you have you have the right to carry a firearm in your home state, you can carry it with you everywhere in the United States. And that makes sense, right? It's a constitutional right to bear firearms for self-protection. And, no constitutional right stops at your state border. Your First Amendment rights don't stop when you go to Nebraska or to Wyoming, for example. And your Fourth Amendment rights, your Fifth Amendment rights, your Sixth Amendment rights, all of the Bill of Rights go with you wherever you are because they're, your rights. They're not, the government's rights. And so this bill would allow for you to, carry a firearm for self-protection across state lines anywhere in the country, so long as you're, legally allowed in your home state to keep and bear arms. It also respects local, state laws you have to carry in compliance with. But, we've seen this, for example, a pretty famous one. It was a woman who, in Pennsylvania, who had a Pennsylvania concealed carry permit. She made a wrong turn somewhere along the way on the highway at night, and she found herself in New Jersey and got pulled over by a state trooper in New Jersey. And she was carrying a firearm for self-protection that she's legally allowed to possess in Pennsylvania, but not in New Jersey. She was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. Fortunately, the governor of New Jersey at the time, Chris Christie, pardoned her under state law, but that should never have occurred, right? Mm-hmm. So you shouldn't become a felon because you made a wrong turn. And so this bill that you're co-sponsoring, is very, very important to allow for the exercise of a fundamental civil liberty, your Second Amendment rights, all across the country. Again, no constitutional right stops at your state border. And that, is an example of where, unfortunately, the Second Amendment, to paraphrase Justice Thomas, is treated as a second-class right, and that needs to stop.
Yep, agreed. I'm proud to be co-sponsoring that legislation and working with you on that. I think you put it quite well. That is exactly right. Now, when it comes to the state of Colorado, Larry, and I don't know how zoomed in you are on what's happening in my home state, but I will tell you, a lot of the people that are going to be listening to this podcast live in Colorado's 3rd District, and they're, they understand the importance of exactly what you're talking about, the fundamental individual right that is provided for in the Second Amendment. And they're concerned about what they're seeing on the state level when it comes to the governor and our state legislature that just keep pushing legislation that infringes on the rights of our law-abiding gun owners in the state. What thoughts do you have? What's the message that you would send to them when it comes to state issues and how we can protect this fundamental right on the state level? And how do we respond in an environment where we have a legislature, for example, or an executive branch on the state level that is very hostile to this fundamental Second Amendment right? What's your message to them? How should they respond? How should we be thinking about this in the context of state laws in Colorado?
Well, unfortunately, what Coloradans are experiencing is not unique. We see this in other states. And, the blue states get bluer, the red states get redder. You have some states that go from red to purple to blue, and I think, unfortunately, Colorado probably fits in that camp. We're seeing it in New Mexico. Um, on the other side, you are seeing states that were blue turn red, like Florida, Iowa. So, but in the case of Colorado, and really in any state, the message I would have for your audience and your constituents is you got to get involved. Elections matter. You can't sit on the sideline. You must register to vote. You must show up on election day and vote. You need to become informed about where the candidates stand on issues that are important to you, like Second Amendment and conservation. And, if you have the wherewithal, consider running for office, whether it's, your city council, your, or whatever level. Run for state office if you're passionate about it, but you got to get involved.
You got to get involved. That was my message to the gentleman last night that I spoke to was get involved. And, the courts, I trust that at some point the courts are, I think there's going to be some stepping in, but I mean, oftentimes the strategy on the other side is to just wear us down and to, to file these lawsuits and to make it hard and expensive and difficult to vindicate our Second Amendment rights. And I would also say, you're right, get out, vote, consider running for office if you're able. That is absolutely something that the citizen legislator is something I completely believe in. As somebody that had never run for office before he went and ran for Congress, I do honestly believe in that. And then supporting, particularly on the state level, getting out, voting, canvassing, door knocking, doing all the things that you need in order to get reasonable legislators elected on, limited government, protecting our individual rights.
You have to hold legislators accountable for their votes. I'm sure you hear from your constituents that they don't agree with you. And I would add the last piece of getting involved and being engaged is consider a couple of things. Showing up and testifying in opposition to bills you disagree with, and personalize your testimony, why this matters to you, how this legislation impacts your life and the exercise of your rights. And if you can't, show up in the legislature, and again, this can be your city council, your town council, your, county commissioners, et cetera. So it doesn't just necessarily mean the state legislature, but it certainly would include that. And if you can't actually come and testify, which, people are busy, they have got lives to lead and families to take care of, take a moment to pick up the phone and call your legislator.
Yep.
Or take the time to write them a letter or send them an email or go to town halls. I'm sure but for your audience, the most effective thing is the face-to-face personal conversation with the elected representative. So go to those town halls. If you see the congressman at the shooting range, take a moment to talk to him. And then next would be making phone calls or sending letters, and personalized letters. Handwritten letters are better than emails, but an individual email is better than sort of these form emails.
I totally agree.
Encourage you to just, that's in terms of being effective at influencing policy and expressing your point of view. That's sort of the hierarchy. First is the person-to-person conversation, then the individual phone call, the personalized letter, or the personalized email. You got to get engaged. Elections matter. And legislators respond to what they hear from their constituents. I know that, Congressman, you have to take that into consideration. Your job is to represent your constituents, right? Not your own personal point of view. So you got to get involved. I mean, Colorado can be turned if enough people got engaged. And what happens in Colorado, with Denver and the suburbs, not unique to Colorado. It's true in places like New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Chicago dominates Illinois. New York City dominates New York. Et cetera. So that's not unique. The population centers passing policy, their representatives passing policy that might be appropriate for, a suburban community or inner city, but does, ignores the needs, wants, and rights of people that live in less populated areas. So it's
Great
important,
advice.
particularly
Well, and
you got to get involved.
I agree, and I will tell you, just as somebody that gets a lot of constituent correspondence, I do. My staff keeps track of all the letters that come in, all the emails, the phone calls, and so I have a sense of how things look. And I will tell you, the likelihood that something gets in front of me and that I see it greatly increases if it's not necessarily part of just a gigantic letter writing campaign where I get 5,000 of the same email, but if it's an individualized letter or email from a constituent that is thoughtful and engaged and respectful, that's something that matters to me on all sorts of issues. And and I what I tell my constituents is I will keep an open mind, and I'm willing to admit that I might not have all the answers on every single issue, and I've got an open mind to feedback on ways that we can do better. So that's all really good advice that you gave, Larry. Now, final question for you. Tell us what is your why? What keeps you going after more than 2 decades of working in advocacy on behalf of sportsmen and Second Amendment advocates and hunters and gun owners? What keeps you going?
I love. It's exciting. It's really rewarding to work on an issue and see it get enacted as legislation. It's very satisfying when that happens. And, we don't always win, of course, and sometimes we lose. But, I just find it rewarding, exciting, just interesting. I mean, when I walk out of my office in D.C., and I turn to the right, and right there, right in front of me, is the Capitol Dome. Like you could reach out and touch it, and it's just, to me, to have the opportunity to affect policy at a very high level, is really rewarding for me. It's just, it just is what I like to do. I can't imagine at this point in my life doing anything else. I'm very proud of what I've built at NSSF with the support of our board and our members. That was not the case when I started 26 years ago. We were a very sleepy little trade association. When I started, NSSF wasn't allowed to be involved in lobbying. But by its charter, that had to be changed because of the existential threat from the city lawsuits. And thank goodness that we built what we have over time. And, we're now recognized as probably the most effective, certainly the most effective trade association in our space. There are some smaller groups, but we've also been recognized by many on the Hill as being, and in state capitals, as being, highly effective and maybe the most important Second Amendment organization in the country, which has become critical because some other organizations have stumbled, unfortunately, and we hope they get that sorted out. But in the meantime, fortunately, we were there to help pick up the slack, and I'm very proud of that.
My guest today has been Larry Keane, Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Government and Public Affairs for the National Shooting Sports Foundation, NSSF. Larry, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And again, thank you for your leadership on the conservation front. It's been really amazing what you've accomplished in a short period of time, like the Wetlands Conservation and Access Improvement Act. Fantastic. And your work on wetlands conservation. So we really, that's just so important to the future of hunting and being able to pass that great tradition on to the next generation.
Amen. Thank you, Larry. I look forward to many more good things to come. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to Hurd in the House. For more on today's episode and updates from Colorado's 3rd District, check out my YouTube and social media channels at Rep. Jeff Hurd, and subscribe to my newsletter at hurd.house.gov. That's HURD.house.gov. And let's stay connected. Until next time, you heard it here first.